I was driving in this morning and I noticed we had a full moon, and that might mean we're going to hear from some callers today who are, well, they've been up baying all night, and their hair is just finally falling back out, and their large canine incisors are beginning to recede too as well. I always like to think that when you're doing a show like this, that everybody you talk to is absolutely sane 100% of the time, and I think we're all aware that it's not quite the outcome, at least not from what I've heard in the first month or so on the job. I'd like to say thank you for joining me this morning. It is a lovely morning, looking for some lovely weather ahead for the next several days. 35 at our studios. It's almost 8 minutes now after 8 o'clock. Bill Colley with you until 10 o'clock this morning, and then, of course, followed by Rush Limbaugh. I had a few things that I wanted to note before we really got rolling today. There's a story, well, a few stories that I'd like to bring up. This debate over vaccinating children continues, and a couple of people are writing today in a couple of different publications. Perhaps we're not really getting the entire facts on this, and the reasons why some people may be opposed, including people like Judge Andrew Napolitano, opposed to the idea of mandatory, that is, forced vaccinations. We'll get to that topic in a couple of minutes if we get an opportunity. Also, I saw a story today at the AP Wire, and that says that it's getting more difficult to hire police officers in Idaho because some of them have been living in states where there are very liberal marijuana laws. In other words, they've been puffing pot. And these young people cannot become officers in the state of Idaho if they have puffed pot within the last 3 years. Fairly easy to tell any longer. They just take a little snip from your hair. There's no other test that's probably as good, and that snip from your hair can pretty much pinpoint when the last time was you were puffing away on the ganja. And today, I'd like to talk with you just a bit, if I could, about a story as well that crossed the Associated Press this morning, and it comes out of the state legislature. Did you know that there was an effort in Idaho to ensure that 60% of high schoolers end up going off and graduating from college? I saw this, and once again, it brings us back to the notion that somehow everybody needs to go to college. You need to borrow money until you're practically bankrupt, and then you need to get some sort of degree, whether it be in engineering or basket weaving or anything in between, and this is somehow going to make you a more well-rounded person. And I can tell you right now, I spent some money, not anywhere near as much as other people did. I think I only spent borrowed about $5,000 to go to college in the early 1980s. And really, if you extrapolate for inflation, that's still not much compared to what people are paying to get their kids through 4 years of college now. And looking back on it, I really didn't need it for being a radio talk show host, or really anything I've done since then. Worked in a hotel doing books, worked at a radio station playing music, worked in television doing some reporting, and then I've worked again in radio the last dozen years or so doing talk shows. I don't know. I could have been just very well read. I don't know that sitting through a lot of classes, most of the activities on my college involved beer kegs. I don't know that we got any smarter by standing around on weekends emptying those things. In fact, it may have killed off so many brain cells, we perhaps are a little slower than we should be today. But this is the story coming out of Boise. Some legislators are casting doubt on whether the state can reach its goal for 60% of Idaho's young adults to have a post-secondary degree or certificate by 2020. Now, that's only 5 years away. State Board of Education Director Mike Rush told the House Education Committee Wednesday that the state currently stands at 41 or 42%. Again, why does everyone need to do this? If you're going to be a heavy equipment operator, why do you need to have a degree in English literature? It doesn't make any sense. Now, it may be fun to do that, and it may be fun to know some of the great books of history, although most of these literature classes now have become politically correct, and all the old classics are gone, and you've got a lot of junk that's since been substituted. However, you can go read those books on your own, and it's not going to have much of an impact on your career if you choose to be a heavy equipment operator or a truck driver, or any number of jobs along those lines that you could be doing. And a lot of these trades, you don't necessarily even have to go on to a 2-year trade school to learn. You can learn them in vocational training, or you can be an apprentice in somebody's business. and pick it up just as simply as you would going off borrowing a lot of money and paying someone else. It would seem to me that the goal really is, and I think a lot of you who probably are sweating this one out with children, is to enrich higher education because it's a machine. It employs a great many people, and most of these people have some investment in the size of the campus and in state government, and that is keeping it large. And one way we do that is have you go out and borrow a couple $100,000 and then leave that debt with your children who may never be able to pay it back because the job market is so dang difficult. A friend the other day had a post that I happened to see at Facebook, and he was explaining that if you took $100,000 when that child is 18 years old and you invested that money, and the child went off and worked in, a local fast food joint, maybe ended up becoming the manager, made a pretty good buck as a manager, perhaps ended up buying a franchise or two, that individual, just from that $100,000 invested at 18, if it's invested properly, could get a return at age 65 in the millions, perhaps tens of millions of dollars. On the other hand, if you end up paying off these huge debts for 20 to 30 years after you graduate from college, all bets are off. When you retire, you're going to be living under a bridge somewhere. This is what we are currently dealing with, and the notion that somehow we have to have all these people going off to college is destructive of a great many lives, although it's a great benefit to all those professors because they get to rake it all in. They'll be doing quite well in retirement, usually on your tax dollar. Be great to hear from one of them, wouldn't it? And let them try to defend, as a good Marxist-Leninist, I'm out for all people, especially myself first. First among equals, yes, just like they are in most communist countries, the few that are remaining that haven't fallen by the wayside because of poor economic planning. You can reach our program this morning. It's 8:14, and you can email me. That is bill.colley, C-O-L-L-E-Y, bill.colley at townsquaremedia.com. Or you can call me at News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com, and that telephone number is 736-0300. I have someone who's been calling since the start of the show, and I don't pick those calls up because they tend to be completely off topic. So I tend to ignore that. Somebody wants to hijack the show, and they've got the most important thing in the world going on in their neighborhood, and they've got to call in and shout it out and interrupt whatever's going on and break the flow of what you're doing. But I will jump around a bit, and I'm going to pick up a call right now. In fact, I thank you for your patience. You're on the air on News Radio 1310 KLIX.
Good morning.
Yes, sir. What's on your mind?
About this college education stuff. We used to be the strongest and most technically advanced nation in the world, and we didn't have a bunch of college-educated people to do it. One thing we've lost sight of, college is great for most things, but we also need the technical side of any education. Without the technical side, trade schools and technical training, you lose your electricians, you lose your pipe fitters, you lose your welders. Everybody can have book smarts, but that doesn't get us when something has to be built.
My dad asked me one time when I was taking, and this is an area where you could work on vocational as well. When I was taking driver's ed, he said, "What do you do all day?" I was in the summer course, and I said, "Well, we sit in class for a while. The teacher lectures us about some traffic laws. Then we go out and drive around for a few hours in the afternoon." And he said, "Have they asked you yet if you know how to change oil?" No. It's not part of it. He said, "Well, if you're going to be a driver, you've got to know some simple repairs and maintenance of your own vehicle. Why aren't they delving into this? They're just having you drive around and teaching you how to pump the brakes and signal left and right." He said, "It seems to me that there's a lot more involved." And there you go. It's this notion that we don't need to know these things any longer.
Yeah, or even how to change a tire.
Yeah, I had to do a few of those too. All right. Thank you much for the call. Have a great day. 736-0300. That number, 736-0300. Bill Colley is the name, Colley. And again, bill.colley at townsquaremedia.com. Another way to reach me right here on News Radio 1310 KLIX and Top Story. And you're up next. What's on your mind? Hello?
Hello.
You've been trying for a while. Can we find out what's on your mind?
Yeah, I want to comment on the school and further education.
Right.
I wholeheartedly believe in apprenticeship, and I think further you go into education, it kind of becomes a Ponzi scheme as I get more and more and more educated and become the professor, then they get paid way too much to perpetuate their own Ponzi scheme.
And a lot of these people are professional students themselves. They've figured out a way to get this grant or the other, their research grants, and they just continue along and end up teaching, sometimes 3-4 hours a week, and then they have their office hours for 3 or 4 hours, and then the rest of the week they're supposedly off doing research. Instead,
and the
they're
more
sitting
the
around.
Kool-Aid I drink, the more I share the Kool-Aid with others,
Yes.
which makes me the king of the Kool-Aid cake.
They're sitting on the back porch drinking the Kool-Aid on a hot summer day or hot spring day when they should actually be teaching.
I wholeheartedly agree, but there are some programs, as the previous caller said, in electronics or electrician or mechanics, but are best served when they're accompanied with apprenticeships.
Yeah, absolutely. In learning from someone who knows the ropes already. Thank you much for the call. My dad is a good example of that. This was a guy, he dropped out of high school, ended up joining the Army. They gave him a GED, but he learned to repair tanks and Jeeps. He was with the 83rd Recon. That was a battalion in the 3rd Armored Division. And he told me the stories about how he had to pick up all of these things, and you had to pick it up quickly. But it gave him some skills that he never, ever forgot and really gave him a dexterity with his hands. He also ended up working as a plant millwright, first of all in an automobile plant, and then later in a plant that assembled battery chargers. So he learned to fix all sorts of other things just in that role, because one of the other millwrights taught him as he was retiring. My dad picked it up. That guy left. My dad took over the job, and he was in huge demand in industry when it was still big in the 1950s and 1960s in this country. And yet he could build a house from ground up. He could operate the heavy equipment to clear the area out. Then he could put in the foundation. He could pour his own concrete. He could put his own blocks in, lay his own blocks. Then he could start building because of his carpentry skills atop that. And then when he got a roof on the place, and that is he'd actually shingled it on his own, then he would go inside and start wiring the house. When the wiring was done, then he would go about putting in some insulation, and then he'd put some sheetrock up or some paneling over the sheetrock. And then the next thing would be the carpets and the baseboards and suspended ceilings or tiled ceilings. And all of this was stuff he would just do on his own. And I'd say, where did you learn all of it? And he'd look at me and say, well, I worked with some people who did it. Or I learned it a little bit on my own in trial and error. Who'd have thunk it? 20 minutes after 8 o'clock. Bill Colley with you, and he was never unemployed. Let me put it that way, never unemployed. He always had work going on somewhere. Always had money in his wallet and money in the bank. We've got a lot to talk about this morning. Speaking of that, you wouldn't believe how many former Idaho education officials are lined up to work on this Common Core thing in education. Details ahead on News Radio 1310 KLIX. I do want to point out, I nearly didn't make it into work this morning. I got a ride today from Brian Williams, and on the way into work, we were hit with what he said was a rocket-propelled grenade. May have been rock salt, actually, just a big chunk of it left on the street, but he was very concerned about it and covered himself in the glory of having survived it. 824, Bill Colley with you on Top Story. It's also 34 at our studios. News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com. Mr. Williams grew up in a small city, the distance of which is probably shorter than the distance between Twin Falls and Boise from where I grew up. Not that I ever knew him. Although I used to work with his main competitor, David Muir. David and I used to have desks side by side. And I'll just point out, David would never fabricate a story about being under attack in a war zone. He would stick to the facts of what he was talking about. We'll just leave that one at that point. I do want to thank you for joining me this morning. I am here until 10 o'clock. I have a couple of things. We were talking about the effort to try and force everyone to go off to college so we can spend, and enrich the university system in places like the state of Idaho. And I came across something someone sent me yesterday in my email. And he found this material, and he sourced it too as well, IdahoansforLocalEducation.com. Do you know that there are 6 people who used to work in the state education department who are all now working on this effort to promote Common Core? They have actually left employ in Idaho and gone to work on this effort. Speaking of big bucks, right? You get paid a lot of money to promote something like that, even if you don't necessarily believe it. And I thought it was fascinating that there are that many people who just simply up and said, you know what? The grass is going to be greener over here, so we're going to promote more government control over local education. And off they went. And then I came across this morning at the Washington Examiner. Obama White House committed to expansive federal role in education. Secretary of Education Arne Duncan, he spells Arne in a strange way, A-R-N-E, on Tuesday announced opposition to a bill that would return more power over schools to the states, reinforcing the Obama White House's determination to maintain its increased role in education, because obviously they know better than you do as a parent or as a local administrator, even though someone like Mr. Obama never actually, probably his skill level would be teaching social studies to the 7th grade. He's in way over his head in his job, so maybe he feels he does have some relationship to education because of that. They have been criticized at the White House by conservatives for acting as a national school board. That's a quote, 3 words, national school board, as Senate Education Committee Chairman Lamar Alexander, a Republican of Tennessee, has called it, although he's not necessarily a conservative. With schools in many states unable to meet standards for education that were put together with No Child Left Behind, Duncan gave them waivers. However, see, this is what happens when you take Caesar's coin. You take Caesar's coin, and then Caesar is going to be giving you all sorts of orders. Your state and local governments have to realize that. You surrender your own independence when you do these things. However, the waivers had strings attached, the writer says, so that states had to operate under different standards favored by the Obama administration. Using the waivers, Duncan can dictate what state standards are and how they are measured. Really, and he was an educator. I'm not knocking him as much as Mr. Obama, but why does Arne Duncan necessarily know more than someone running a school system here in Idaho? I don't know. I don't think I have an answer to that one, and I don't think he would if you really pressed him on it. Oh, he might throw out his resume, but lots of people have long travel logs behind them. You're up next. You're on the air on Top Story on News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com.
Yeah, good morning. Right now, there's the federal high-stakes testing, and the Madison superintendent has gotten his representative from up that area to sponsor a bill called H.R. 65. It's being held up by the Ways and Means Committee, and I understand Speaker Bedke is also not wanting this bill to see the light of day. We need to have your listeners get hold of the Speaker and members of that House Ways and Means Committee to get this thing out on the floor so it can be. And what this would do would give school districts the option of not doing the federal testing and doing a much less expensive, much less time-consuming test that would be much more in line. And any of us have been studying the Common Core thing, and right in line in what you're saying, the federal government is taking over our local schools, and the local school boards are really going to be meaningless if we don't stop this Common Core. But this is one thing we can do, is to get the federal testing out of our schools, or at least give the school districts the option that they can do an alternative test to this high-stakes testing, which is extremely. I think it's interesting that, like you say, Luna and his cohorts there, they've all got lucrative jobs after pushing Common Core into the state of Idaho. I think that's travesty.
I've got just a few seconds left before break, but once again, what's that bill number so people can jot that down?
H.R. 65, and it's held up by Bedke and the House Ways and Means Committee. So I would certainly appreciate it if people get hold of the Speaker and the members of the House Ways and Means Committee. There's a crane from the Nampa area.
All right, on that, I got to let you run, but thank you very much for the details. 8:30. We've got more on the way on Top Story with Bill Colley. A little law enforcement discussion coming up right here on News Radio 1310 KLIX. It's 35. We have a guest joining us in the studio this morning, and he's here on a monthly basis. We were just talking off air a couple of minutes ago because the date of his last appearance was New Year's Day, and there weren't many people here in the building, so I was a little worried that Sergeant Keith Thompson would show up at the door and there wouldn't be anyone here. But first of all, welcome.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
In fact, this is a rotation we do, so we mix it up between the state police as well as the sheriff's department, and then as well as Twin Falls Police. And we were just having a conversation because we've had some unusual weather. Actually, it's not just Twin Falls. We've seen it in, I think, Boise as well in the last, 5 to 6 weeks.
Yes.
And it's just been this tremendous blanketing fog that sometimes lasts for a couple of days in a row. Not going to be a problem today. Right now we're looking at sunny skies, 34, at least for the most part today, sunny skies. That's what the weatherman tells us. We'll trust him. It's 8:35, and you're listening to Bill Colley on Top Story on News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com. Fog, though, it plays a lot of tricks on drivers.
Yeah, fog is that thing, I mean, you got to be careful about it. It's time to put your headlights on. It might not help you necessarily see better, but it helps others see you better. And you need to slow down. And we've had a lot of complaints, and I've seen it while I've been out there. A lot of people are just, for whatever reason, they speed limit says 65, so by golly, I'm going to do 65. And, there is the law that even overrides that is driving with prudence and care to your abilities. And you got to realize that it takes a second and a half to even react to a situation in front of you, and that fog really increases that danger. So
I saw some research years ago that said that people literally driving in fog, it does something in your brain, and so they'll end up speeding up because they think in the fog that if they're not looking at the speedometer, they don't think they're going as fast as they should go. So they end up maybe picking up the speed a little bit. It's like an illusion that happens when you're driving in it, and you have to really pay attention to how fast you're driving.
Right, and just everything that's coming up. I mean, driving is one of those, it really is a skill set that we need to keep our concentration on the road. I think about the first time I ever had to turn on my emergency lights in the fog is like back in the 70s disco or something. And it's kind of entrancing, and you have to watch that. But it's just, we have it. It's that type of season. So when that fog's there, just maybe plan a little bit earlier to leave a little bit earlier and slow her down a little bit and be careful. Realize also the roads are icy within the fog time as well.
And sometimes, I had a friend years ago. I was at work doing morning radio, and he worked on the station in the next broadcast booth, and he came in late, and I said, what happened? He was driving in fog, came over a rise in the road, and there was a horse standing there. So in fog, you can't see a lot of these things.
And those animals are disoriented as well, and they're coming across. We get a lot of deer accidents during the foggy season as well. And then the main thing is if you do crash in the middle of the road, try to get to the side of the road. Don't stop in the middle somewhere. Just get out there. And sometimes it's safer to get out of your car and actually walk off the road a few hundred feet. And until that clears up or until emergency personnel could get there. So
if you have a breakdown in the fog, too, you want to try to get off the road as quickly as possible on the far end of the shoulder.
Yes, as far as you can get off that road. So
I was going to say from a perspective of the drivers, because we hear these advisories and when they're issued in these situations, a lot of people have been driving a long time, and they just say, I've been doing this for 30 years. Sometimes there may be more too relaxed than, let's say, even a young person who's inexperienced would be in those situations.
Yeah, and the reality is this. I mean, we should all know it by now. If you're going to drive, sooner or later you're going to be in a crash. How prepared you are during that time, and whether it's your fault or someone else's fault, you could be the best driver in the world, but the guy next to you might not be. So
it's odds then, right? I mean, the longer you drive, it's just like spinning a roulette wheel.
It is. It's kind of like when I learned how to ride motorcycles when I was a kid, my dad told me, you're going to get in a crash. Sooner or later, you're going to get in a crash. He says, be ready for it and try not to make it your fault. Sure enough, I've been a couple crashes that way, but also with vehicles, it's the same way. If you're going to drive long enough, sooner or later, you're going to be in a crash.
And we have these terrible accidents we hear about in some places. I think Pennsylvania had one just a few weeks ago where they had some thick fog and they had 30, 40 cars involved in it. And once that happens, what's the safest thing to do if you're in the middle of that?
If you're in the middle of that, if you're in the middle of the big pile up, you might as well just stay in your car at that point. because not too many things are going to be getting past you. But if you're in the start of it, and we get in southern Idaho, we get a lot of those brownouts where the dirt and everything's coming over the farmer's field. It's the same situation. Do not stop in the middle of that. I mean, you proceed at a slow pace, but you need to get through it. And if for some reason you are stopped, you are crashed, get out of your car, walk a good 100, 200 feet off to the side of the road. That car is not a protection system when someone's coming at you at 60 miles per hour.
I blew a tire one time on an interstate, and I had my 6-year-old with me, and I carried her up about 100 feet on the embankment, sat her down, said, "Stay here while I change the tire." She wasn't happy about it,
Right.
but I thought that was the best course of action if you've got little ones with you.
Right. And I mean, it's not completely safe no matter what, but make it as safe as possible.
And for people out there, if they are doing some traveling and they need to know road conditions ahead, what do you advise?
They actually can. I can't remember exact number. I think it's 511. Or if they just call the ISP dispatch, they could also give them that number or let them know what the situation is.
Okay. Well, Keith Thompson, I'd like to thank you for coming by today.
Thanks, Bill.
Hopefully we can do this more often without holidays interrupting us.
Look forward to it.
Not that law enforcement isn't busy on New Year's Day.
It's true.
Doing a lot of mop-up action sometimes. Again, thank you much.
Thank you.
35 is our temperature right now at our studios. Coming up on 840. You're listening to Top Story on News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com. Happened to see a story today, and we talked about this, I guess, as early as Monday this week. If people are arguing about vaccinations and should we have our children vaccinated, and there's a lot of debate going on because first Chris Christie mentioned that he didn't think government should have as much control as it does in vaccinating, making the decision, rather, I guess is a better way to put it, about who should be vaccinated and who shouldn't. And then Rand Paul followed it up. And because these two men are both Republicans, media didn't like it. And media then said, well, we got a measles outbreak in this country, and you people are you're going to be harming America. You're not fit to be president because of that. Well, the measles outbreak is caused by their own fellow travelers in their own political party, bringing, and I'm not, these are nice children, but bringing all of these children to this country from Central and South America, bringing them here, and a lot of those children were not vaccinated against measles. That's why we've had these outbreaks. Let's make that clear. So you can't dodge that particular situation, and you can't dodge that explanation. It is so obvious. In fact, where the outbreaks have been, the most serious ones are the areas where they've had large concentrations of where these children were resettled. I have a solution to that problem. And that is, if these children are coming here and they don't have parents, or they're going to be separated from their parents for good, or their parents have abandoned them, then American conservatives ought to adopt those children and raise them in your own ideology. That would be a real kick in the pants for the Democrat Party if that were to happen. Here's the thing about vaccinations. In our argument over the last few days, I understand you'd be angry if your own child caught measles because the neighbor didn't vaccinate his child, and his child came down with measles. But then you hadn't vaccinated yours. If you vaccinated your child, then your child supposedly has immunity. And it doesn't matter if there are 100 children on the playground who aren't vaccinated. Yours is going to be the one who's not going to be bedridden for a week trying to get rid of the measles. Simple, right? Why are we having that argument? Number one, that I wanted to get that one out of the way. But I came across a couple of other things today, and I think they're worth mentioning. Judge Andrew Napolitano, who is one of the, I think, strongest adherents to the true notion of our Constitution in this country, has a column at Washington Times today saying to vaccinate or not to vaccinate. Nothing in the Constitution gives the government ownership of our bodies. That's the subheadline. And he said to Rand Paul, who of course caught the Dickens from the media earlier this week, the issue is not science. Because people have been saying, well, Paul is a doctor, he should know better, and he's just trying to curry favor with extremists and radicals, and that's wrong. He's going to hurt our country. That's the explanation you're getting from the left. But, of course, he comes, Mr. Paul, from America's leading libertarian family. There's an actual book out about the Paul family saying that they're the first family of American libertarianism. According to Judge Napolitano, the issue is not science for Mr. Paul. That's because in a free society, we are free to reject scientific orthodoxy and seek unorthodox scientific cures. That could be prayer, for instance. We have an argument going on right now. There's going to be some discussion at the state legislature in Boise about perhaps looking into some new laws, because we have some people in the state of Idaho who do not vaccinate their children for religious beliefs. So government is trying to wrestle with that one. Some believe, of course, we should force them to do what government wants them to do, or force them to do what their neighbors want them to do. You know, government was not intended to be your cudgel. I hear a lot of people out there who talk about government infringing on their liberties, but they don't have a problem with government infringing on someone else's. The issue, according to Paul, is this, and this is from Judge Napolitano. Who owns your body? This is a question the government does not want to answer truthfully, because if it does, it will sound like Big Brother from George Orwell's novel 1984. And that's because the government believes it owns your body. And trust me, they do. You've got to understand that. The people, the longer people are in government especially, and especially the bureaucrats who live their lives there, that's all they think about is, how they're going to control people. They are thoroughly convinced that that's their job. That's what they've been hired to do. The writer goes on to say, Mr. Paul, and no less an authority than the U.S. Supreme Court, have rejected the concept that government owns your body. Under natural law, because you retain the rights inherent in your birth that you have not individually given away to government, the government does not own your body, rather you do, and you alone can decide your fate with respect to the ingestion of medicine. What about children? Paul argues that parents are the natural and legal custodians of their children's bodies until they reach maturity or majority, somewhere between ages 14 and 18, depending on the state of residence. Doesn't that answer the question for us? This is not an argument about a measles outbreak. This is an argument about government once again trying to say, well, you don't know enough to raise those kids, so we'll have to do it for you. And government, they've done so well with everything else they've managed over the last 50 years, haven't they? Then I came across this, Accuracy in Media this morning, Cliff Kincaid. Cliff Kincaid used to be a semi-regular guest on a radio show I did in another state. I was introduced to him by a mutual friend. And he says, can you handle the truth about vaccines? And he writes, the National Vaccine Injury Compensation Program exists to compensate victims of vaccines. Did you know that? That there is an actual government program, and it has a budget, and they compensate victims of vaccines. Well, what does that mean? Why would they have to compensate people who have become victims of vaccines? The latest statistics report shows nearly 4,000 claims were awarded financial damages. And these are now into the billions of dollars, we need to point out. Why do both sides, he writes, of this debate pretend that vaccine-related injuries do not occur? Why not just report the facts? Observers believe the glaring omission reflects the power of pharmaceutical companies or their advertising agencies in major media. It is in the interest of these companies to make pariahs out of those favoring vaccine choice by playing down or even suppressing questions about vaccine safety. So in other words, when you're turning on your nightly newscast, remember that, and you see it even over at cable as well, most of the ads are coming from major pharmaceutical companies. It seems that half of America has some sort of dysfunction below the waist, but these are the people who are propping up the news media. And they want to ensure that they continue to sell drugs. And, media can make all of its claims that we're above this sort of thing, but media doesn't have the luxury any longer of ticking off its advertisers. Because if you do, you're not going to be in business long in media. So you see what we're getting at here. And he writes, he has a whole list, by the way, of vaccines that are actually listed by the government. I mean, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13 vaccines that the government has had problems with and has had to compensate people because of this. And he says the diphtheria vaccine had been associated with brain inflammation and brain damage, while polio paralysis can be caused sometimes by the vaccine. If there are no problems, he writes, associated with vaccines, then why did Congress pass the National Childhood Vaccine Injury Act of 1986, which created a National Vaccine Injury compensation program. Do we have to continue to raise this question in light of all of the evidence then? We have a caller with us. You're joined by Bill Colley this morning on Top Story on News Radio 1310 KLAX, newsradio1310.com, 35 at 8:52. And we just want to know what's on your mind.
Hello. You're 100% right about the vaccines. There's two entities in the world that is unfairly messing over the people, and that is the oil companies, and number two is the pharmaceutical companies. They're both multi-billion-dollar industries. They have the power and money to do what they want to do, and the little people get the short end of the stick.
The pharmaceutical companies wrote the Obamacare law. When you really break it down, they were involved along with a couple of different health insurance companies, and this notion that this was all designed to benefit you, no. There might be a secondary benefit, but the real benefit was to all of them.
They want you to believe it's for your interest, but it is not.
I thank you for the call, and I had a conversation a couple of months ago. A friend of mine had been an executive with an insurance company, a large insurance company, and I was telling him about my doctor prescribing the CPAP mask for me. And he said, yeah, I had one of those for a while. He says, doesn't make any difference. He said, people have been snoring for ages. It's just a way to take more money out of your pocket. I thought, you know what? I hadn't thought about that. 8:54, and I gave it up a couple of months ago. I'm